Good afternoon. I'm Bill Harris, the director here at the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. And today I'm very pleased to welcome Harvey Kaye, an Emeritus Professor of Democracy and Justice at the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay. He's an old friend here at the library. He's spoken here before. We always love to have him. Welcome back, Harvey.
Thank you. It is such a pleasure. And I'm going to now make it clear to everyone, congratulations, Bill, on becoming the director.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's an honor. And today, of course, we've got a wonderful book to talk about, your book on the Four Freedoms. And Four Freedoms are ever relevant, or should be ever relevant, because even more than sort of something that's aspirational, we would hope that they're bedrock in what we do every day and how we think about what we do. So I always like to ask this question just to start. What brought you, or what made you want to talk about the Four Freedoms in relationship to the past and to today?
Sorry, and I hope I don't take too much time explaining this, because there's actually a bit of a story behind it. I grew up in a FDR Democratic household, so there was no question about how the family felt about Franklin Roosevelt. But my first major work in American history, because I trained actually in different fields than American history, but my first work was on Thomas Paine. And what I did was I told the story of Thomas Paine's life and labors, and then basically retold the American story through Thomas Paine as the legacy of Thomas Paine. And when I got to the Roosevelt years, the thing that really struck me, because this is important, everyone had assumed that Thomas Paine had been forgotten in American history. Everyone had assumed that conservatives and reactionaries of all sorts had suppressed Thomas Paine's memory. And then there I was in the 40s, the 30s actually, in the late 30s, and first of all, Eleanor Roosevelt, in a very, very small but important book, The Moral Basis of Democracy, dedicated more pages to discussing Thomas Paine on questions like freedom of worship, freedom of religion, freedom and democracy than she did to anyone else for anyone else in the book. And then, of course, I went through, call me crazy, I went through all of FDR's speeches. I was looking for some kind of acknowledgement on his part. And what was striking was that on the Washington's birthday weekend of 1942, when FDR was going to explain to Americans that indeed we were capable of a global two-front war, and he had everyone get world maps to see what that entailed, he opens that fireside chat on that Washington's birthday weekend, recalling Washington's retreat across New Jersey to the Delaware. And he then reviews the state of American forces, the trials and tribulations of MacArthur in the Philippines. I mean, he really covers all the bases to get Americans ready for a serious, long-term, quite long-term possibly, war effort. But he closes that fireside chat with an amazing set of remarks. He starts quoting Thomas Paine's famous lines from the first of the American Crisis Papers. These are the times that try men's souls. And he quotes it at length. And basically, to paraphrase FDR, he said, Paine spoke for us then, Paine speaks for us now, because Paine promised that the triumph would ultimately be, this great moment. And so I thought, wow, here's FDR. So I paid all the more attention to FDR's speeches in the wake of doing that book, Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. And I had an first idea was I was going to write on the Economic Bill of Rights speech of January 1944, because I thought it was imperative for Americans to be aware of that speech, the popularity of those ideas, and then, of course, how it had come to be suppressed in ensuing years. But just around that time, a professor who ended up at Harvard, a law professor, Cass Sunstein, brought out a book on the Second Bill of Rights from a legal perspective. And I thought, I don't want to look like I'm piggybacking on Cass Sunstein. And I talked to my editor, and he says, well, let's go bigger. He says, think about going bigger. So as I backed away and I looked at the trajectory of FDR's work, I saw, as I'll maybe get to talk about later, he opens one of his big campaign speeches in 1932, after he's won the nomination, is calling for an economic declaration of rights. And then, of course, in January of 41, he gives the speech, which is essentially the call to arms for Americans even though the war, our involvement in the war directly would not occur until December 7th of that year. But that speech that he delivers, that State of the Union message of January 41, closes on the four freedoms. And I thought, wow, it all hangs on the four freedoms, okay? Both in terms of America's purpose and promise, and moreover, in terms of America's, if you like, responsibility. And so it was that moment where I said to my editor, you know, what I really like to work on, in some ways to honor my parents' generation, is FDR and the Greatest Generation. And I want to frame it in terms of the four freedoms. And as I went through the work on that, I mean, I took several years to do it. What struck me is, despite everyone's claims that Americans couldn't tell you what the four freedoms were during the war, and I've had a lot of arguments about that, it was striking the degree to which the four freedoms not only became a slogan, okay, for, you know, a war bond drive and any number of speeches, but indeed it actually became the definition of that generation when you think about the generation of the Depression, the war, and then, and everyone thinks of my generation for the 60s, but actually it's that generation which elected liberals to office, elected literally veterans of the Depression and World War II into Congress. And and what Lyndon Johnson pursues, basically, in terms of the Great Society and the war on poverty, is a further extension, and not to mention immigration reform, okay, Medicare and Medicaid. In many ways, the story of Roosevelt, and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. himself talked about the long age or great age of Roosevelt, really does extend from 32, 33, all the way through. And I see the four freedoms as the spirit of that generation, the ethos of that generation.
And it's interesting that you should mention the very fact, or not the fact, but the discussion that's had about whether Americans knew the individual four freedoms, freedom of speech, religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. But in some ways, what I find interesting about them, and then when one thinks about the generation and this moment in January 1941, this kind of transition from one sort of approach to another focus, is that there is overlap within them, so that one is interrelated with the other, and so that in some ways it is important to know the different ones, but at the same time they all build upon each other as and they're less powerful without the others together with them.
Right. Think about African Americans in the South whose rights were being suppressed ever since the post-Reconstruction era. Okay, the idea of freedom of speech and expression was intimately linked to freedom from fear.
Yes,
right?
That's right.
Given the muggings of elderly Jewish, men and women on the streets of places like Boston and Brooklyn and elsewhere by really reactionary sort of almost, Hitlerian kind of youth in America. Okay. I mean, freedom of worship may have been the case, but that freedom of worship extended beyond a synagogue or a temple.
That's right.
To this whole idea of freedom from fear, to be able to walk the street kind of freedom. So yeah, they're absolutely very decidedly intimately connected. And the other thing I'd say, and this was also very striking to me, when I get into a subject, I just dig in. And it was really, it really was amazing that when you looked at it from the vantage point of the generation that heard that speech, whether they were in their 60s and 70s or younger, when they heard FDR's words, we shouldn't assume that what FDR said exactly was what ended up being in their memory banks. So, and what I mean by that is that most people, when asked about the four freedoms, even if they couldn't name them individually, they could actually speak to them, number one.
Yes.
And the other thing was that they heard that speech, not necessarily in the global terms that FDR wanted them to hear it. They heard about it in terms of, we've come through the New Deal, and the New Deal is not going to stop. Okay. We are going to extend the rights of working people by way of industrial democracy, the National Labor Relations Act. We are going to make sure that all faiths are honored in their respective ways, that immigrants themselves will be understood as American as anyone else, whether, native born or newly arrived. And indeed, and to take it even further, that freedom from want, which the New Deal spoke directly to, that they would continue to pursue it, which would literally at some point leap us to the Economic Bill of Rights. And that freedom from fear, I mean, Americans actually said that they heard it in those terms. And the polling groups that followed up on these things, they were convinced Americans, they wanted it all. Okay. This is before the Economic Bill of Rights.
So is it, it's not though, it's a call to, it's a political expression in that sense, of programs that can advance a certain set of ideals, let's say, or principles. But
Right.
it is beyond politics, those notions. It's how you achieve them or how you move forward may have a political solution, right? But
absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
so let's go back then and think about FDR and how he got to January 1941. Let's go back to, I'm struck by Herbert Hoover calling him a radical because FDR, as the scion of an old family, Democrat though he may be, he was certainly a man of the establishment.
Absolutely.
Completely. And his wife, also the niece of a Republican president.
Right. So, to whom FDR himself was a cousin. I mean,
yes, that's right. So he embodies the establishment, and yet he's a radical. Well, he's everything to everybody in a way. He's a communist. He's a socialist. He's whatever you're afraid of when it comes to change, isn't he?
Yes, but FDR, in his own way, he feared something more significant. Okay, see, so FDR, he's born in the late 19th century. He's born in the middle of the Gilded Age, and he grows up in a political and economic order in which, the expression, the rich are getting richer and working people are barely holding up their own, and many are enduring poverty. Okay, it's an age in which, if you talk to the foremost intellectual of his day, William Graham Sumner at Yale, it's an age of social Darwinism. What do classes owe each other? They owe nothing to each other. What's the role of government to be? The role of government is to protect property and assure the capacity to own all the more property. I mean, it's everything we think of as reactionary. And that was the prevailing political and economic order. Now, there were challenges. There were the populists out here in the Midwest. There were the progressives in major urban centers. And there were, of course, also the socialists who were a rising force. And in fact, in 1912, when Teddy Roosevelt was one of the four candidates for president, it was said that at least three of the four candidates were truly progressive in some way. Now, FDR is growing up in these circumstances. Somehow or other, long before, and I take nothing away from Frances Perkins, extraordinary woman who knew FDR, extremely well. But she makes it out as if FDR doesn't really become the Democrat, small d, the sympathetic, sort of humanistic Democrat until the 20s, when he's enduring suffering polio, and he's educated by Eleanor and the people she introduces him to find out more about working class life and so on. FDR from the very beginning has been questioning and even trying to find a way to act politically that he would not be taken as a socialist necessarily. And so, for example, in 1912, when he gives a speech at the People's Forum, he actually talks about, well, look, we pretty much effectively achieved liberty of the individual, obviously something of an exaggeration. But the trick is, he says, how can we pursue liberty of the community? He was looking how, and this is the key thing, how to create a force that would keep the robber barons and their ilk from continuing to prevent Americans, to deny Americans, the majority of Americans, from enjoying, or at least having the chance to enjoy, the promise made in the Declaration and the Constitution. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and a government of we the people. He is, even as a young man in his 20s and 30s, however, he may not be a deep intellectual, or, he by no means, but he was seriously thinking through these political questions. And he comes out in 1910, entering the New York State Senate, he becomes, he's aligned with the progressives. And that is the key. And he's identified. I mean, he's got two kind of mentors in that respect. He's got Woodrow Wilson, who wins the presidency in 1912, a progressive Democrat, and he's got his own cousin and his wife's uncle, who he's now related to all the more, Theodore Roosevelt, a progressive Republican. Now, this is the interesting thing. He through these years, already in speeches, is revealing his small d democratic instincts. And I won't go through all those speeches. After World War I, and many of the progressives lined up with Wilson during the war, people had believed there would be a furtherance of the progressive politics, progressive legislation to try to tame, control, reform the, if you like, the greed, the selfishness, the corruption, the violence-inducing power of that class of corporate bosses who emerged during the late 19th century. However, it's an age of reaction, the 1920s, and we often get the wrong view of the 20s by way of films and other things because it's the roaring 20s. But most people don't realize that working people, urban and rural alike, actually suffered a decline in their income. The farmers barely recovered from the recession following World War I, and working people, the only way they sustained the household income that they had was by way of both members of the family going out to work. Now, in this moment, FDR has suffered the polio. FDR starts to develop a new politics. Okay, he doesn't leave behind progressivism. Progressivism is a force pursuing reform. FDR wants to go further. This is where Perkins really got onto something, and that is he becomes all the more humane, and Eleanor has introduced him to socialist Jewish women organizers in New York City, labor organizers, and he comes to see that government has more, that to harness the powers of democratic government is not merely a matter then of reforming the Gilded Age or reforming industrial capitalism. It's also a matter of uplifting those who are without. This is the liberalism that he's cultivating during the 1920s. But here's the thing. By the time of 1929, and then 30, he realizes that it's that Gilded Age capitalism and that class no longer necessarily called the robber barons, but the foremost richest men and women in America who are really responsible for the Great Depression, the crash and the Great Depression. And he already is beginning to see, in part by his education, in part by Eleanor's influence, in part literally by the folks whom he's interacted with when he's Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, when he's literally meeting the women organizers that Eleanor introduces him to, he realizes that you got to go beyond just liberalism. And this is where, and he never uses the term, he becomes a social democrat. His campaign in the spring of 1932, in which too many historians have dismissed it as not well planned and well organized, really have missed the boat. It is an agenda for social democracy. And if you read his speeches during that year, he is definitely looking not only to uplift, he's looking to empower working people. And in fact, in 1930, he told a good friend in a letter, I can prove it, I got it up here on my wall here. He tells a friend, I think it's time for this country to go fairly radical for at least a generation. Now, Hoover didn't know of that letter, but Hoover knew full well what FDR was saying on the campaign trail in pursuit of the Democratic nomination. And then he drives it home, FDR, of course, in that speech of his, that acceptance speech. This is important. That acceptance speech is the promise of a New Deal. He takes this agenda he's laid out and he promises a New Deal. Moreover, I'm pretty sure it's in that speech, he actually says that economic laws are not a product of nature. They are humanly created. That is one of the most radical statements of the modern age. That's the kind of thing you'd almost expect to hear from the likes of Karl Marx, okay? So Hoover's, in one way, how does he come to judge him as a radical? The guy's from this, very privileged background, our man FDR. But in many ways, Hoover saw what a lot of people may not have seen, that he was confronted politically by a radical. who was going to literally bring an end to the Gilded Age order, the Gilded Age political and economic order. And he was going to do it not only by harnessing the powers of democratic government, but he was going to engage Americans in harnessing that power and empowering them to do so. I've come away, little by little, I came to the conclusion that FDR was a radical. Okay, maybe not in the same sense as, the standard radical who buys into a particular political orthodoxy or a political creed. FDR is a radical because his understanding of American history makes him a radical. And anything that would obstruct the promise of the founding needed to be confronted, challenged, and quite possibly overthrown, which he literally calls for doing when he accepts the nomination the second time in 1936 in Philadelphia. I mean, it's just amazing how people can ignore these kinds of things.
Well, what I find fascinating too about that is I love the way you capture him as a radical. What I find also fascinating about that, he's a radical that wants to not only work within systems, but to expand the systems in order to accomplish what those goals are. So it's not revolution and overthrowing, it's adapting and modifying what we have to move that forward and to address first, let's think about those four. First, to address the freedom from want and the freedom from fear and those interactions that have brought America to the brink at the time. You've got to get your table set before you can feed somebody a meal. So it's,
Well, sorry. In fact, I'm glad you took me in that direction, because one of the things that I really have come to see, and this, by the way, owes to FDR's Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, who later, I'm talking Rexford Tugwell, okay, who had been a member of the Brains Trust, who later writes 2 books about FDR. The one, and I'll just show everyone, I'll do a show and tell, hoping not to throw everyone off, but this particular one, The Democratic Roosevelt, is just a fantastic book. And I actually literally keep in my wallet a quote from this book. He says, "We are a lucky people. We have had leaders when the national life was at stake. If it had not been for Washington, we might not have become a nation. If it had not been for Lincoln, we might have been split in two. If it had not been for this later Democrat, Franklin Roosevelt, we might have succumbed to a dictatorship." Now, here's the interesting thing. We may be a lucky people, but the other thing to consider is that each one of those figures, those leaders, was made great. And those are our 3 greats, because the American people pushed them even further than they might have imagined going. Now, here's the interesting thing. FDR loved history. It's every one of his speeches just resonates with the American story. And if you look closely at what he's doing in there, is he's not, some people call him the history teacher in chief, and I've done that myself, but it's more than that. When he delivers his speeches, as friends of his noted, he's actually speaking to Americans as if they know what he knows, and they're thinking along the same lines as he's thinking. So in essence, he's trying to engage them in this New Deal project, not simply with their labors, right? Or for that matter, their own labor struggles, but also wants to engage them so that they will come to see themselves in a liberal or indeed social democratic fashion. And I marvel at his capacity to do that. I mean, given the fact that he came from this Hudson River aristocracy, and yet he had this sensibility, which may have developed in the 1920s, to be able to engage. I mean, people actually believed when he gave fireside chats that he was in their living room, or they had somehow been invited to the White House, because he spoke to them, whatever his accent, upper class, nature of his accent. The fact was they heard him as one of them, and hundreds of thousands of people responded to him saying, "I want to hear from you." They sent letters to the White House.
Indeed they did.
But this is the other thing too. Given his knowledge of history, I'm convinced, and I think I can show it by way of some of his speeches. I'm going to show it by way of some of his speeches in a piece I'm writing right now, that he took a note from the revolution, the founders, and even more so in many ways as to how to confront a crisis from Lincoln. Just as Lincoln, pushed by slaves escaping the South, by Frederick Douglass, with whom he actually became friends, was pushed and enabled to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, to do what he had longed to do. He saved the United States by making America radically freer, more equal, and more democratic, whatever failings there were. Well, what FDR realized is that the way to save America in the face of the Great Depression, as he told his friend, is we need to go fairly radical for at least a generation. And he did things even during World War II, which actually strengthened the New Deal efforts. And in fact, I think some historians are right to say maybe the war effort was like a third New Deal.
Well, that's why, as we move forward or think about, again, the For Freedom speech, which when that speech is so rich and rife with language and phrases that are so important. It's hard to think of it as not being an inaugural address, because which would come to 2 weeks later. It has such a wealth of meaning in it that it straddles these two periods, right? The Depression and World War II.
Yes, and in fact, what's interesting, when he gives that speech, he knows Americans don't want to give up the New Deal, and he tells them, "Look, we have to turn ourselves into the arsenal of democracy. But that doesn't mean we're going to give up what we've achieved or we're going to suspend it." And he knew he was basically telling the Republicans, there's no way I'm going to defer to what you're asking me to do. Okay. So what he does, of course, is he says, we actually should enhance what we've been doing because we have to make ourselves all the stronger by way of doing so. And then there's an interesting thing, which, only recently did I pay more attention to it. After he gives the speech, he actually says something about American history, which undeniably is a bit of an exaggeration because he talks about it as a peaceful process. But he calls the American story a peaceful revolution. And that gives you the sense that the revolution, and by the way, the revolutionary changes that took place in the course of the 30s, he saw, just as he over and over again emphasized, were in the fundamental American tradition. Now, let me sidebar all of this and say we are not oblivious to the failings of FDR and the Democrats and the American people at that time, the failings regarding Jewish refugees, the failings regarding Jim Crow in the South, and truly the tragedy of the internment of Japanese Americans. But we should also remember that those very people who suffered or endured the most, Jewish Americans who may well have wanted greater refugee access, the African Americans who were still suffering Jim Crow, and the Japanese Americans whose families were interned, they actually participated in the war effort in a decidedly, if not enthusiastic, energetic and determined way. I mean, I don't need to review all of that. You can look in many books to remind yourselves of it.
Well, when we think of those four freedoms and of the injustices of the American experience, it doesn't negate what the aspiration or the move towards justice is. What it does is highlight the need to continue to agitate and advocate for that. And that's what, as we've worked on an exhibit that's upcoming in the spring, the Roosevelt's Black Americans and Civil Rights, what we do see are those failings. But what we also see, which is even more powerful, really, of a aspect of the story, is that when opportunity is presented, you organize and you fight and you move forward. And you take that little door that's cracked open and you push your way into it, and you keep on. And that is true across the board for opportunity and rights. And so I don't know.
Yeah. It's A. Philip Randolph. Many of us know full well that A. Philip Randolph, challenged FDR, right, to open up the defense industries to African-American workers. And FDR felt compelled to do so. And he signed 2 executive orders, one ordering the creation of the Fair Employment Practice Commission, the other one doing, making it all the stronger. But what people don't realize is that Randolph himself actually developed that March on Washington movement, the threat of bringing tens of thousands, and as he told FDR, 100,000 African Americans to DC to demand their place in the defense effort, soon to be war effort. is that he did so because he heard the Four Freedoms speech. That's that door opening that he took advantage of. And by the way, after he was in the Oval Office with FDR and secured the opening of the defense industries, he either wrote or said to someone, I knew I'd get what I wanted, or I'd never have been invited to the White House to talk with FDR. So, it's like he'd already been in the White House. He knew Eleanor. He was no stranger there necessarily, but he knew the drama, and he knew how to take advantage of that opening. Yes, absolutely.
Well, this is why this moment in 1941, where this transition which has been occurring over the last probably 18 months or so, well, the president's mind for longer, is he recognized the external threats. He had clearly been busy addressing the internal threats to what our security was, and trying to secure that and advance, as you say, with the American people, the ideas of the Four Freedoms. Well, the other two are bedrock in the Bill of Rights. So now, and looking internationally, where that is not that's the threat, that he sees lurking right there. Now we have to secure ourselves and the world even beyond what he's been talking about previously with freedom from want and fear, because it's all interconnected.
Yeah, it would, if I can fantasize for a moment, nothing, especially in this very cold moment here in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and the blizzard we're about, nothing would warm my heart more this winter, in light of what we've been going through with the rise of a kind of neo-fascism in America, and politicians who are scorning American history and literally denying the powers of the Declaration and the Constitution, Bill of Rights. It would be just great if we heard our leading figures, whether it's Biden, Bernie Sanders, whoever else, stand forth, maybe together, and actually remind the world that we remain committed, however much it may be under assault, to the ideals of those four freedoms. And make it even more fantastic to hear the Democrats, at least the Progressive Coalition, come forth and talk about FDR's 1944 State of the Union, the Economic Bill of Rights message that he delivered, hoping that at war's end, Americans might be able to pursue and push Congress, basically, to make sure that all Americans had a right to a job with a living wage, the right to a comfortable home, the right to to health care, what was then called universal health care, the right to a good education. In other words, FDR, it's funny, FDR had said he would wait till the end of the war to pursue the New Deal ideals again. And then he did it anyhow in that speech of January 44.
Well, what I find fascinating about your book, too, is how there's a notion of kind of reclaiming history in a way, and reclaiming the idea of patriotism, that certain aspects of the way in which we experience memory, the way in which the greatest generation was honored, neglects the world in which the greatest generation grew out of, and the sets of values they were fighting for that influence the next 20 to 30 years of how our nation structured itself and defined itself legislatively, for that matter.
Yeah, I used to tell my students, I said, you may not understand the fact that this generation, they were maybe 15 years old in 1935. Many of them might have the men at least might well have ended up in the Civilian Conservation Corps. They would have been engaged in the labors to rebuild America, or the Works Progress Administration, or the Rural Electrification Agency, or the Tennessee Valley Authority. I can go on and on and on. The rebuilding, the reconstruction of America. They experienced it. They knew it was possible. Okay. And they're only 15. They fought a war against fascism between 1941, a war that had begun in 1939, and 1945. And they won in concert with their allies. And they were at the war's end, many of them, a mere 25 years old. In 1955, when the American economy was exploding, when one of every three workers was in a labor union, when taxes on the wealthiest Americans had never been higher. Okay. They were only 35. And in the 1960s, which admittedly my generation in its own chauvinism thinks of as its decade, those folks are only 45. And as I think I said earlier, they elected this liberal, indeed progressive House and Senate, still filled with the Southern, white supremacists, but nevertheless, look at what they accomplished. Again, I'll repeat: Medicare, Medicaid, immigration reform, civil rights, voting rights, environmental laws. And I'm probably missing out on a number of other phenomena. Oh yeah, educational opportunities were expanded radically. So if you go back and you think 15, 25, 35, 45, FDR endowed that generation. They were already patriotic in their own way. He endowed them with a vision of who they were and what they could accomplish.
And I think it's fascinating too how you really hold accountable the left and the right for how they approached the idea of the greatest generation, what the response was, or what the purpose was, what was that serving beyond honoring a generation who had participated in and rightly claimed the victory for a set of ideals that were far removed from fascism. So I'm fascinated by that both on the extremes of each are kind of missing the overall point. They're losing the narrative.
Right. Conservatives were just have always been determined. They were determined to suppress the New Deal, and they were decidedly determined to suppress the memory of the achievements of a generation. So if you look back into the, especially late 80s, 90s, into the 2000s, the Republican conservatives, they celebrated that generation for their war effort, for the heroism, the bravery, the courage, for which that generation deserves accolades, deserves to be celebrated, deserves the monument on the Mall in Washington, D.C. It's interesting, however, that we forget how close that FDR memorial is and that World War II memorial is, and how intimately linked those two moments are in American history. But the sadder part, in fact, I was angry enough about what conservatives were making of the greatest generation, but my own sort of colleagues and comrades on the left, they literally were buying into it in a kind of knee-jerk way, the narrow understanding, okay? There were some who even said, well, we're celebrating the greatest generation because we're just getting the conservatives, the elite, the establishment, they're just getting us ready for another war. They completely missed the boat on the fact that Americans going through the trials and tribulations that we always seem to go through, we're looking back and trying to embrace a generation that had truly saved democracy, and not just by defending the status quo, but by dramatically transforming the country in favor of freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear in the course of the 30s and 40s. Let's not forget, FDR didn't just sit back and come out with the four freedoms to give a nice State of the Union message. He was empowered by what Americans had achieved during the 30s. And for my generation to somehow fail to recognize the literally not just the power, but the capacity of a generation to transform America, that we were failing to figure out what we might do. We were just literally taking the critical, sort of hostile stance. And I mean that. If people look at the book, I review the kinds of remarks I made. And then the tribunes, whether it was the great documentary filmmaker Ken Burns, the historian, whose name I just blanked on, of course, and Tom Brokaw, who were celebrating the greatest generation, rarely, and by the way, in some cases, never mentioned the four freedoms. So in essence, I felt like, well, somebody's got to do something. And that's really, really why when I looked at the bigger picture, as my editor, who was a brilliant fellow, said I should do, I thought, whoa, what we're missing out on is the power of that story. And I think we're still missing out on that. I mean, when I see the kinds of things that I see, whether in the public discourse or on Twitter or anywhere else, and the amnesia that Americans have regarding what enables them today to appreciate what they have and what they now owe, not that generation, but their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. It scares me.
Well, on a hopeful note, we're still here talking to you about this book, which is now a few years old, and yet ever more essential to be reminding people that narratives aren't always one way or the other, that there's complexity and nuance, and yet we have to remind ourselves, and there have to be those like you and frankly us at the FDR Library who are brokering the past in a way so that people can formulate their views and opinions and not do it in, blindly in the dark.
Yeah, I mean, if I could, there in the Economic Bill of Rights, there's a very interesting thing that only reactionaries notice, as if like FDR was so outrageous. They wanted to assure Americans a right to recreation. Think about that, a right to recreation. And by the way, the commission that helped FDR compose the Economic Bill of Rights, they called it a right to adventure. And I can tell you, and I'm not doing this to patronize you, I can tell you the adventure that I would urge for people to have is not only to find their way to Washington, which I love the National Mall. I mean, ever since I was 10 years old visiting the National Mall, I never go to DC without walking the monuments. But I would also tell people to find their way to Hyde Park. Now, I can't tell everyone to go into the library and do research. You guys would be overwhelmed, okay? But I can tell you there was nothing more thrilling to me when I was working on that book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, than to hold the originals of the speech, of the drafts of the speech of the Four Freedoms, the 7 drafts. And I'm sure every historian who's ever bothered to do that kept hoping that they would rub somebody's, the DNA of FDR as they touch those papers. But seriously speaking, I mean, it's moving to visit, just as it's moving to visit Springfield, it is moving to visit the FDR Home and Library. And I urge people to do that.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And what I think part of that is, and I've worked in here for 7 years, and I've worked in archives for a career, and that literally physical connection to the past. It's not the past. You're living it in that moment every time you hold those documents. But what you get, I think, on those grounds, when you think about what made FDR who he ultimately became, as we all evolve and change, we hope, or should embrace. Certainly Mrs. Roosevelt's a perfect example of someone whose life evolved in thinking and continually evolving. That you walk the grounds. You don't even need to come into the buildings. And I'm saying that I should be encouraging everyone to buy tickets, but you can walk those grounds, and in that place that seems rural and so far away at times, this young man formulated a series of ideas that were so much larger and broader than where he was and who he was actually. And that there was a point, I always say this to school children when I see them, that right there was at one point almost the center of the world, fighting fascism, fighting for the defense of democracy, right there. And that the Four Freedoms, those ideas, that generation, that what we take with us forward, that's what powers the future. All of that right there with us. And that's what I love, how your book draws out from memory and that idea too.
Yeah. And there's something else. If I could just drop, I want to just drop this in. If anybody becomes so enthusiastic as to go look at all of FDR's speeches, or at least a selection of them. And I, for what it's worth, I've got my FDR Four Freedoms book up. I later edited this volume, FDR and Democracy, and annotated it and all that kind of stuff. But there's a speech by so many of FDR's speeches are so worth reclaiming. And there's a speech that he gave in Cleveland, Ohio in October 1940, as he's running for his third term as president, the unprecedented third term. And he speaks to Americans about those who would deny them what they have achieved, but he also speaks to them about what they have achieved. And he doesn't say, my administration has done this, you should elect. He actually reminds Americans of what they have done. And he lays it all out piece by piece, what they have done. And he's not exaggerating. He's talking about their labors, their energies, their struggles, whether it had to do with reconstructing America or reforming America by creating a labor movement, a housewives movement in support of working people, all of that kind of stuff. And then he lays out, and this is where he really, truly shows that he remains fundamentally not just the liberal that we all know him as, but the social democrat that he never called himself. He lays out a vision. This is 1940 of what still remains possible, what Americans can still achieve. It is absolutely beautiful. I'm not telling you it'll bring tears to your eyes, but if you read that speech and don't get enthused about the possibilities, but don't forget, it isn't just that you wait on your president. He actually told a journalist in 1932 that he never wanted to get too far out in front of his fellow citizens, which what he really was saying is, help me, fellow citizens, push me along. It's the only way. Well, it's that famous story. I agree with you. Now make me do it. He wasn't being snotty when he said that. What he meant is, I need to show Congress that you're all with me.
Well, it's remarkable. The Four Freedoms are ideals. They're something to aspire to, but they're also something you put into action. You can put into action.
Yes.
And I think what, I think I'll close on this for comment from you. I think what I find fascinating is that when you don't condescend to people, when you don't patronize them, when you speak to people about big things in a way that incorporates you in the conversation and doesn't set yourself above them, that, wow, a lot can be accomplished.
You described FDR. Beautiful.
So, well, thank you, Harvey. As always, just a pleasure. And we hope to have you at the library, as you say, soon, and maybe in the spring. And we invite everybody, of course, to participate or to come to the library, use our research room by appointment, and come enjoy everything that's there for you. So
thank you. And my best wishes and Merry Christmas to all the staff. This may come out after that. Best wishes, Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year to all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.